Hi, everyone. Welcome to Race, Crime, and Justice in America. This is the first lecture video where we're going to talk about the history. And so, if you got the textbook, this is all of chapter one. We're going to go through the information. We're going to talk about some of the key points, the book itself, and the narrative that they're talking about, and they give a lot of data. It's all important. But the point of a lecture video is I highlight the key points. So obviously, you need to read, you should listen to the lecture, you should look at the slides I'm providing, and there's going to be things that you might have to adjust as you go. So I'm going to start off. This is not in the order that the book goes, but key definitions. These are terms that we're going to use in this first section, but are going to be used throughout the class. These are the definitions from the text that we're using, this small textbook. These are the definitions they give, and we're going to use those as we discuss this. So, race is a category of people who share certain inherited physical traits, including skin tone and facial features, while ethnicity is a subgroup of the population with shared social, cultural, and historical experiences. And already we have something that's not written here that I want to emphasize. With this kind of model and definition, race is seen as more of a social concept. So while we understand race, we tend to put race as a physical attribute, as something that is inherent. It's something natural. Um, it is a social concept, and in this definition, ethnicity is what we consider race. So when we talk about race in our everyday speech, um, we kind of consider it more. Um, Ethnicity is more of what we're implying race to mean. So, very specifically, so ethnicity is this shared social, cultural, and historical experience. This is your culture. This is who you are. This is your biology. This isn't physical traits. This is who you are, where you come from. Race is the physical attributes that are more of social concept rather than physical applications. So hopefully that makes sense, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to this quite a lot. Racial prejudice in regards to this is negative attitudes and perceptions about social categories of people because of their perceived race or ethnicity, and racial discrimination is harsher treatment and or the denial of rights and opportunities because of one's race or ethnicity. Real quick, I want to emphasize here, there can be prejudice and discrimination not based on race. Obviously, this class is talking about race, crime, and justice, so our focus is going to be on racial prejudice and racial discrimination, but it should be noted that other individuals who are not that are being discriminated are not being discriminated based on race. We have ableist speaking, which is discrimination towards those with any kind of physical or mental, I don't like using the word disability, but or handicap for that matter, but these are individuals who are discriminated against based off of how they are or what situation they're in. I'm using terrible language. I'm sorry for anyone who is uh, would be considered disabled. I'm trying not to use ableist speak as I'm talking about this. Um, Discrimination can be based off of gender identity. We see this happen quite a lot. It can be sexual orientation. It can be sexual discrimination. It could be, you know, towards a particular sex, aka, feminism exists and the women's rights movement happened because of sexual discrimination, gender discrimination, ageism, age discrimination. Any group can feel discrimination or prejudice, but I want to emphasize here that this class, I'm not belittling anyone's feelings of discrimination or prejudice in their life, but our focus is going to be on racial prejudice and racial discrimination. things that are based off of the inherited physical traits. Okay. Or their social, cultural, and historical experience. All right. So when we talk about in the textbook, they're going to talk about criminal justice involvement with these things. And so these really are just the ways the criminal justice system interacts with individuals. We're talking police officers, lawyers, judges, corrections officers, probation officers, guards, any number of individuals, and it's just the way they interact with them, typically in arrest, conviction, and or sentencing process. And it can also be included in stop and questioning and searches without suspicion. And the idea is that their suspicion is based off of racial prejudice. Obviously, we will talk more about that as we look at examples in the coming weeks. Racial disparities, outcomes that affect one race or ethnicity more than another. We're going to see this in this first chapter already, but yeah, we'll talk about that. Mass incarceration, which is just the idea that longer and more certain prison terms for convicts, typically of violent crimes, but also includes drug offenses. And this is a big one. Conventional crime is the things that you typically think of, which are violent crimes, property crimes, and drug offenses, often called street crime. This is hopefully just a quick reminder for criminal justice students. A felony is a serious crime that results in an extended stay in the prison system, whereas a misdemeanor is a less serious crime that typically sees imprisonment of less than a year and possibly fines. Obviously, because this text is written for not just criminal justice, but for sociology, social work, that kind of thing, the definition needs to be there. So if you're not familiar with those terms, you're learning them now. So, going with the order of events for quote-unquote history from what this text is looking at. And so it starts with this 1944 Gunnar Myrdal's study of racial inequality and race relations in America. He's a Swedish social scientist. And his actual study was titled, this is the actual title. Obviously, it uses a very outdated word to mention the Black community. So, An American Dilemma, the Negro Problem, and Modern Democracy. I feel dirty saying that word, but I do have to read it as is, so apologies there. So our Swedish social scientist was brought into America to look at race relations and try to figure out what the heck was going on specifically with African Americans, with the Black population. And his final report, almost 1,500 pages, boiled down to essentially it blamed higher levels of poverty and other problems from racial prejudice and inequalities encountered from birth to adulthood for these individuals. This was the reason for the negative race relations and racial inequalities in America. It was because higher rates of poverty and the problems that come with that, as well as the problems of essentially from birth until your adulthood, you are treated unfairly. That leads to the growing inequality and terrible relations between the races. That was the finding in 1944. That's important to note. Have things changed? The old saying is, things change, things stay the same. So we jump ahead a bit. Lyndon Johnson, one of the former presidents, Lyndon Johnson, started a commission on growing crime. There was an increasing crime rate in America at the time, and so 1965, President Johnson initiated a commission to discover the cause for this growing crime rate in America. And they did all their research and their studies, and 2 years later, 1967, the commission's final report officially put out and blamed, quote, urban residents higher crime rates. So the urban areas residents higher crime rates on many negative social conditions in which they lived. Crime flourishes and always has flourished in city slums, those neighborhoods where overcrowding, economic deprivation, social disruptions, and racial discrimination are endemic. 20 years after Gunnar Myrdal's study, and things hadn't really gotten better. Crime flourishes and always has and always will in slums where the poorer are, economic deprivation is there, social disruptions are the norm. A lot of reasoning of, drugs seem to be the only way out of that situation. So it leads to crime, racial discrimination, forces individuals to be in these areas when they shouldn't be, or they deserve something better, or maybe not even deserve, but, were in a better place. There's a lot of issues with this. And the higher crime rates in the urban areas are because of the negative social conditions where they live. That's all it comes down to. That's the takeaway. Because of where they live and the conditions that they're living, that's why there's a growing crime rate. And that's not Lyndon Johnson's only commission. He also did a commission on riots, because during this time there were a lot of riots. There were the race riots during the 1950s and 60s. There were a lot of issues. And so this particular commission was looking into urban riots in the 1960s, and much like the previous one, its whole goal was to figure out what the heck it was all about. The final report attributed the riots to the history of racism and racial inequality in the United States. Period. So this is a long quote that is often used and pulled from this. It's a famous quote from this particular report. And I have it in the entirety from the textbook, but the quote that's pulled. So, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated much of American life. They now threaten the future of every American. Race prejudice has shaped our history decisively. It now threatens to affect our future. White racism is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II. The continuing gap that we see between groups of people, and while this class we're looking at race, crime, and justice, this applies to any group. When we see the ever separating gap, rich and poor, black and white, whatever it may be, the unequal separation, it is systemic. It is part of how we were made. And that's unfortunately something that I know a lot of people as Americans, regardless of your race or ethnicity, it's difficult to come to terms with. And I'm not saying my fellow white students in this class, you should feel, quote, white guilt or anything. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that for every student who is a citizen of the United States of America, it is important to know that racial prejudice shaped our country. It shaped our history. We left Great Britain because of religious persecution. We wanted that freedom and we came here. People have been coming here, and our country has always had some kind of prejudice against someone. We had slaves when we first started. We literally took the land from the Native Americans and slaughtered them over the next 3 centuries. We did it to every race. It didn't matter if they were dark skinned or light skinned. Like, legitimately speaking, American history is racial prejudice. It is a key part of us. And I'm not saying that we all are racially prejudiced or racist or anything like that, but I'm saying that our history, how we came to be, is deeply entrenched and tied with this. We cannot separate it. Pretending that we were never or are not is ignoring that, is not helping. When we acknowledge it and we know what has led to it, we can learn from it, grow from it, and hopefully we can be better. So, point is, we've always been in this kind of ambiguously gray area. And so, post 1960s, kind of, because in the mid 1960s, this is when, we finally got quote equality. Legal segregation ended at this time, so there were no longer the separate water fountains for white and black, that kind of thing. There was still segregation by individuals, and there were still racially charged beliefs and behaviors. Unfortunately, this is where I could say there's a semi-modern example that we can look at, and that's the former President Obama. President Barack Obama was the first black president. That is a major milestone, and love him or hate him, policy-wise, politics-wise, doesn't matter how you view him as far as politics and policy. What it comes down to, though, is that throughout his time in office, and even in the years since, and in those first, running in the primaries, every accomplishment, every idea, every thought, every word that came out of his mouth was highly judged and highly looked at, and there were people that would not accept him. Really, Not My President started with, it's been going on forever, but Obama was the big one for Not My President, from people who were racially biased against people of color. And so, yeah, 1960s, we saw, equality in air quotes, but this is, he was elected in 2008. Gone in 16. Like, this is fairly recent, and we still have issues with racial prejudice. So it's important just to note that it's still around. So, not calling out anyone if you're one of those people that are like, well, it's not really around anymore. It is. Just because you don't see it or you don't experience it doesn't mean it's not real. Gets into a deeper philosophical conversation that I am not qualified to teach, but I would be more than willing to get into a friendly discussion outside of class regarding that stuff. Anyway, a quote from the text that I actually really liked: "A mountain of social science evidence shows that the color line remains a paramount problem of our current century." And that, I think, is something that I want to tie into other things that we've talked about, or I've talked about in other criminal justice classes. The data is there. We have mountains of evidence that shows that these things are a problem, but they're still not accepted, or they're still pushed back against. Why? Part of that has to do with that word before science: social. Social science is seen as a soft science, so there are debates about how legitimate that is. That's not a, well, this is kind of the place for that argument. But we see it with crime rates. We see it with prisoners. We see this with death penalty. We see this with punishment. Like, These are things that we've had mountains of data that says, yeah, these don't work, but we still do it. Or we have mountains of evidence that say we should be doing it this way, but we don't. Why? And that's a question for you to just kind of ponder about. So if you're in if you're in Intro to Corrections, this should be familiar to you, the 1970s, because we talked about it literally this week. But for my people in Race, Crime, and Justice, the 1970s, we saw this shift within the larger criminal justice system where this view of rehabilitation for individuals who are incarcerated, it wasn't working, so now we had to be tough on crime. This is the crime control model for those of you who are criminal justice in that other class. But the idea was that as rising violent crimes and convictions became the commonplace, we saw changes in policy beginning, and we're arresting more individuals. At this time, this is, racial prejudices grew. Riots and crimes committed by people of color were broadcast on television and talked on the radio. This is validating people's previous racial prejudices. These are people that are, white suburban America that go, oh my gosh, that riot was comprised of all black individuals. That means that all black individuals are going to cause problems. No, that's not how that works, but it validates those beliefs they already had. And then we get into one of the things that I personally get very upset about, not necessarily related to the race problem, but overall problem. And this is the war on drugs and the crack cocaine epidemic. Two different presidents have had direct connections to this, and it's why it's a problem among other things. But so President Richard Nixon and President Ronald Reagan are the two presidents that are connected to this. President Richard Nixon started this, quote, war on drugs, and the goal truly, they said the idea was publicly, the goal was to remove drugs from the streets and make America safer. The reality was they wanted to associate African Americans, blacks, with heroin as a drug. And Nixon had a thing against the hippies. So he wanted to associate the hippies with marijuana, the blacks with heroin. And the idea was that if we make both illegal and we make them public enemy number one, everyone's going to be on board with any kind of arrest ideas we come up with. And that's what they did. And sadly, it worked. It's why now we're finally seeing a change. We're seeing, a lot of people pushing back about marijuana. Marijuana is ever moving closer to being just legal across the board. It wasn't illegal before this time. It's literally just the war on drugs. Nixon wanted to put it all together, and it worked. And then when President Ronald Reagan came in, he continued the war on drugs because that was the Republican thing to do. You follow what the established idea is. And he also focused on a new rise in crack cocaine. So this is a quick reminder, essentially pharmacologically speaking, like at the chemical level and what it does, crack and powder cocaine are almost identical. It's really the way they're used and the intensity of the high and things like that. So when people talk about crack cocaine and crack, they're all the same thing, essentially. There's just the different ways that they're ingested. So powder cocaine is, of course, snorted, inhaled through the nasal passage. Crack is typically, lit on fire, boiled, and either ingested orally or, can be direct syringe into the individual. Obviously, these are different. These are different methods. They get slightly different highs, but they're the same essential thing. But this is something that I want to identify that people tend to not really think about. Powder cocaine has always been considered a glamour drug. a party drug. These are things that traditionally, historically speaking, white businessmen from the 1960s to the 80s and beyond somewhat, because I do know, I don't know personally individuals, but I do know some people who have worked with individuals who have been at business conferences where the big cheeses get together and they do cocaine. Um, I don't have particular names, but this is something that still happens. And part of this problem is that because of the way it was viewed, oftentimes officers would turn a blind eye towards powder cocaine offenses because they were, you know, high, rich, powerful white men committing a crime, whereas they could be tough on crack cocaine offenses because crack was sold to people on the streets. They were sold to the poor and predominantly to minorities. It was just the perfect way to continue incarcerating individuals of color. And so um, I emphasize just this one set of statistics from the text. Um, but if you are following along or you're interested, from page 8 until page 11, they really talk about the statistics of, corrections, jail inmates, things of that nature. But they also have a nice little chart on page 9, just kind of showing the number of sentenced prisoners per 100,000 incidents of 18 years or older, broken down by race. But the big statistics to pull away from this is that African Americans comprise of 33% of all prisoners. That should be of, not if. Sorry about that. Although they account for only 13% of the U.S. population. At the time of writing this book, which is right around 2018, 2019, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. So only a few years ago, 33% of all prisoners were African American, despite being 13% of the overall population. That's an interesting piece. Now the term is Latinx, but Latinx comprised 23% of all prisoners and likely a higher percentage, and we'll talk about that in just a second, although they account for only 18% of the population. So part of the issue with the Latinx percentage when we talk about these kinds of studies is that not every system is the same. Some systems have just a white label, which they put Latinx in that category. So when compiling data from across several different institutions with different intake methods, the Latinx population is not always accurate because you have to go through the white population percentage. So there is an issue there, and obviously you can see in the next one, non-Latinx white comprise of only 30% of all prisoners and likely a lower percentage because of this issue. And that's the thing. Non-white or non-Latinx white account for 61% of the U.S. population as of the time of writing this. That's pretty big. But why is there a higher percentage of prisoners that are African American when they are only 13% compared to the 61%? If you are having a hard time understanding because you go, oh, well, 30% is 30%, 33%, yeah, it's only 3% more. 33% of a total 13% is a lot more, statistically speaking, than 30% of 61%. It is a larger number if we look at association. I know that's complicated. If you're confused about that, feel free to email me and I'll try to explain it more clearly. It's one of those things I feel like I need to see you face to face to kind of explain. You need to see my facial features and my things like that. Anyway, so the big question related to this, and I'll give you a hint right now, this is a question that is a discussion board and could possibly show up later in possibly an essay section on an exam. But the question is, why do these disparities exist? And the disparities I'm talking about is 33% of all prisoners are African American, but that 33% is coming from only 13% of the total population. Um, why do we see this disparity or this gap between these numbers? And so there are three questions that need to be asked when considering this issue. Number one, do certain groups commit more crime? Number two, is the way the laws are worded inherently biased? And three, are the people who work in the system, officers, judges, inherently biased? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. And I mean yes to all three. So I'll talk about it in just a second. No, I'll talk about it right now. So, do certain groups commit more crime? When we look at the social science and the criminal justice data and things of that nature, yes, we see individuals of diverse ethnic backgrounds, in particular of African American and of Latinx origin, we tend to see a higher rate of crime being committed, which would then mean yes. Do certain groups commit more crime? Clearly, yes. But that doesn't mean that they commit more crime. This just means that these are individuals who are caught committing a crime. So, see, consider higher crime rates do not mean that a certain group commits more crimes. It just means they are more visibly incarcerated. The other thing with this is that why are they committing more crime? And so, when we consider the social science view of it, are they in terrible conditions where we see historically groups who are impoverished tend to lean towards crime more often? Is it then their fault that that race is committing more crime, or is it because of the situation they're living in that they are forced into? Now we get into that big, complicated, depressing issue. The second piece is the way the laws are worded inherently biased? Well, I guess it depends. So, and this is something that I urge you to take criminal law if you haven't. But the way laws are formed, they're very carefully worded. And part of understanding how the criminal justice system in America works is that we have the state systems, which are individual states. They have their own laws, but there's also federal laws. And the concept of state laws can't supersede federal laws is complicated. But the idea is that are there places where the laws are worded in a particular way that's not outrightly biased, but is clearly having a bias? Yes, this is true. It's not everywhere, but there are definitely places where there are laws that are worded in such a way that it is illegal to be poor. It is illegal to be of a color other than white. These are issues. And then coming into another thing from corrections, the criminal justice system is highly political. Are the people who work in the system inherently biased? Yes and no. There are plenty of people who work within the system, officers, judges, lawyers, corrections individuals, guards. Like, there are people out there that are not biased. They are people that see the good in everyone. They're people that want things to get better. But there are people who are biased, that have that bias sink into how they operate. And so these disparities exist because certain groups commit more crimes, laws are inherently biased at times, and the people who work in the system are also inherently biased in some areas. But they also exist because all of these things are true because of the way our system is designed and things aren't necessarily clear. Welcome to the conundrum of why things have not been solved yet. This is a question that does not have an easy answer. There's not a simple one-to-one. This is one of those, you can have all the data, you can have all the ideas, but at the end of the day, this is complicated on so many levels. It's not as simple as, I mean, it is as simple as don't be biased. But how do you do that in practice? That's difficult. So another thing, just to mention real quick, regarding this and disparities in crime, remember that white collar crime is typically dominated by white individuals because it's, you know, insider trading, embezzlement, things like that. They rarely see arrest. You tend to be given fines and you pay it off. You don't really see the arrest. So those rates aren't being appropriately applied to these statistics. So that's another thing to just keep in mind. And so the last thing that our first chapter talks about, it's not really history, but it's something that we need to recognize and talk about, is the collateral consequences of mass incarceration, this get tough on crime. It affects three groups: the offender, the family, and the community. And on the offender, obviously there's an increased fear for one's safety, a loss of freedom and autonomy, lower prospects for employment, educational opportunities, housing, and relationships with non offenders. These are the obvious ones. There's one that's kind of a weird one that the text mentions and doesn't really go into, but loss of heterosexual relations. Um, it is a well-known uh, piece of information that there tends to be a lot of homosexual relationships within prisons, especially during long sentences. So this loss of heterosexual relations, it's worded very unfortunately, and it's definitely related to both a stereotype, but something that's somewhat accurate about the system inherently itself. Um, but individuals who are in this group, when they get out, there are fears related to how that is viewed because you were in prison. And the idea is that were you the person giving or the person receiving, which is very offensive the way I'm saying it, and I don't mean to be, but these are the kind of implications. Um, as a white male individual, despite being a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, I am a B. I'm bisexual. I cannot speak for other communities. Um, Individuals that I know and have worked with and have been friends with for years who are members of uh, certain communities of different color and background and ethnicity, some of them are very still homophobic. And so this is something that could be a serious issue for an offender given their culture. Um, just going to leave it at that. If, not if, uh, all right, sorry about that. My microphone died while recording, so um, apologies if something sounds weird or different. My microphone died, so I had to use a different microphone. It's not as good. But so yeah, if anyone is a member of a community where your particular community has some strong uh, feelings on homosexual relations uh, regarding individuals who have been to prison or just in general, please, let me know because I'd like to hear from people from those communities. I know that they have existed, and I know some of them are still active. I don't know how many still believe it. So the second group that is impacted is the families. Typically, the direct effect is on children, and this is because, and again, from the time of writing of the text, more than 2.7 million American children have a parent in jail, at least one. And there are several more that have had a parent who was in jail and is now released. And so that is a large number. That's just important to note. But with this, there's a loss of household income when a parent goes to jail. You essentially are putting in a child in a single parent household or potentially in foster care. if it was a single parent to begin with. There's a lot of issues that can directly affect a child. A general sleeping and eating problems can arise from this kind of unsure stuff. If you're familiar with psychology or in particular like therapy with children, these are all like telltale signs that something's going on. So these are like ways that children are directly affected. But the loss of stability tends to affect school performance, which there's been studies that show that this leads to an increased risk of committing criminal actions. So then the children get involved in the system, and then unfortunately, the way that works, they're more likely to commit as an adult, and then the cycle continues. This is an issue. And then the community is another group that does get affected by all this, and that's with reduced prospects for the offender in general when they're released. The chances that they will repeat offending rises, which directly impacts the community they were released to. This could be, continuing that crime or bringing new crime in or whatever that may be. So the community is being affected that way. But there also an increase in drug problems and mental health issues. Important to note, low-income and minority communities typically had higher rates of incarceration to begin with. So, being released back out there just is adding to that. Not to end on a down note, but the issue here, at least for the community, is that release doesn't help the community, but more incarceration doesn't help either. So what's the solution? As you can see, there's not a solution. That's where we're going to end this lecture. I urge you all to think simply about this if you can. This is not a homework assignment. This is just something I'd like you to think about. If releasing an individual who's committed crime doesn't necessarily help a community, but neither does increasing incarceration, what is the best way to help a community? Just put that out there. Anyway, thank you very much. Apologies again that my microphone died during recording. Hopefully this last part is not completely unintelligible, but I will see you all in the next lecture video. Bye for now.